The other day, I posted a video critiquing Hugh Ross, where he argues in an article that atheism is the result of rebellion of those who refuse to accept the overwhelming evidence for God's existence. With that in mind, I now thought I would make a short video talking about Romans 1:20, which is this key verse that Christians often go to, and I want to offer a brief critique of the attempt to use Romans 1:20 as a sort of clobber text against atheism, to claim that atheists are in rebellion against God. They refuse to accept or acknowledge the existence of the God that they really do know exists. I want to argue against that use of Romans 1:20, which I think is a harmful proof text. I've talked about these issues before in other videos, but I don't know that I've got one video that kind of just focuses on the key verb katharatai, which we're going to talk about now. So let's read the verse. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Hence the interpretation of this Christian who argues for what I call the rebellion thesis, which is that all atheism is a manifestation of rebellion against the evidence for God that is present and overwhelming for all people. That's this key thesis. And those who hold the rebellion thesis cite Romans 1:20 as evidence of their thesis that atheism is always a matter of sinful rebellion of the overwhelming evidence for God's existence. What's wrong with this mode of argument? Well, let's look at this. Have been clearly seen. What does it mean to have been clearly seen? Now, this is a translation of the Greek verb katharatai. And katharatai simply means to be seen thoroughly or clearly. Now, this is what the advocate of the rebellion thesis then is going to say, is that Romans 1:20 clearly says that God's existence and nature are clearly seen simply by looking at the world around us. Now, I will say one aside that there are two different ways to interpret this. One way, in keeping with the rebellion thesis, is to argue that this clearly seen is a properly basic or a priori response to the presentation of the overwhelming evidence for God's existence. That there's no discursive or reasoning process at play here, but it's simply when people see the world, they form naturally the overwhelming belief that God exists and has a particular nature. So that's a non-discursive or properly basic interpretation. There is also a non-properly basic interpretation, which says that whenever people see the evidence for God manifested in the world around them, they form some sort of immediate intuitive discursive reasoning process. So it begins with intuitive responses to the manifestation of God in the world, but then it results in, through a quick steps of reasoning, in belief in God's existence. So don't worry about that. That's really not germane, really, to my main point here. My main point, however, is to focus on Atharatai. So the argument here is that this establishes that God's existence and nature are clearly seen. Let's dig in a little bit more to illustrate how to view that. So here's the illustration. Imagine that you work in a large office building without windows or without direct access to windows in your area. And you and your colleague come into the building early in the morning before sunrise. And the forecast for the weather that day is that it's going to be overcast and raining. And then uh, around lunchtime, you step out of the building and you see that it's sunny. So you go back inside and you tell your office mate, who's still working in the darkened bowels of the building, hey, it's actually sunny today. And he says, no, it's not. It's overcast and raining. Now, you are basing your judgment upon your immediate experience of the world outside. He's basing his upon what appears to be an errant weather forecast. So you said, well, let's go look. He agrees. So you both go outside, and this is what you and your office colleague both see: the sun, no rain clouds, a couple clouds, but nothing threatening rain, and just blue sky and dry pavement everywhere, I should add. Well, I would say this is katharatai. It can be clearly perceived that it is sunny today. And if your friend at that moment responded by saying, it's not sunny, it's overcast and raining, at that moment, you would know your neighbor, your office mate was engaging in a bad faith response. So he or she would be refusing to acknowledge the overwhelming evidence for God, for not for God's existence, but for a sunny day. And what this rebellion thesis advocate is how they're interpreting Romans 1 is that Romans 1 is pretty much like that it's saying that the evidence for God's existence and nature is overwhelming. It's katharatai. It cannot be denied by any rational person. So any person that claims God does not exist is equivalent to this individual looking up at a blue sky and saying it is overcast and raining. And if a person did that, you would conclude either they were fundamentally delusional and irrational, or they really could see that it was, in fact, sunny and they were engaging in bad faith. And so this interpretation of Romans 1:20 says anybody who says God doesn't exist or that God doesn't have a particular nature, the nature of being perfectly good and all powerful, that any person who doesn't take that interpretation, they are arguing in bad faith, just like this person refusing to acknowledge that it's sunny. Okay, that's the interpretation. Now, what is wrong with that interpretation? Here, I think one thing we have to recognize is that in all theology, it's not just a process of a priori exegesis, but it's a process of reflective equilibrium in which you bring a particular verse, an interpretation of a verse, and say, this is what the verse seems to say. But then you take that and you bring it into dialogue with other evidence and then consider whether the evidence still warrants that interpretation of that verse. And sometimes the a posteriori evidence is going to require you to consider another interpretation of that verse because the a priori at face value interpretation is no longer defensible in light of this empirical evidence that you've identified. Let me give you a quick example of that. One of my go-to examples is to talk about corporal punishment. There are Bible verses that support corporal punishment, physically hitting children and slaves as a mode of discipline. A couple examples from Proverbs 23:13 and 14. Do not withhold discipline from a child. Though you strike him with the rod, he will not die. You shall strike him with the rod and rescue his soul from Sheol. Here, the word rod is a sebet. It is like a whip or a hickory switch, something like that, like a stick. And it is not simply a metaphor of authority. It is that the proverb is advocating physical discipline, corporal punishment, hitting your children as a mode of disciplining them. And for that reason, Christians for centuries beat their children because of teaching like this from the Bible. They hit their children and they believe that that was the best way to educate them. Today, there's overwhelming empirical evidence from psychology that this is actually a very harmful way to raise, rear, and discipline your children. So what that would require is we have to go back to Proverbs 23 and either think there has to be another interpretation, or this is the right interpretation, but we have to do something else with the text. Point being that you can no longer conclude it is in fact the case that you should beat your children because the empirical evidence is overwhelming that you should not. And so that requires a rethink of what's going on in Proverbs 23. Second example, we can take, let's say, from Joshua chapter 10, where it refers to God making the sun stand still. Now, that reflects an ancient Near Eastern cosmology in which the Earth is fixed. It's like a flat disk in a three-story universe, and every day the sun travels over the sky, over the Earth, moving around the Earth. That is not a cosmology that we accept anymore. So, whatever you think in addition about Proverbs chapter 10 are some Copernican or heliocentric understanding of how the Earth revolves around the sun rather than vice versa, requires us to reinterpret whatever is going on in Joshua chapter 10. And so once again, you see a posteriori evidence requires, or empirical evidence requires a rethink a reinterpretation of how to interpret and or apply the verse in Joshua chapter 10. And I'm going to argue something very similar at play when we read katharatai in Romans 1:20. Here's the simple reason why. Because if the claim of the rebellion, advocate of the rebellion thesis, is that God's existence and his nature, by which we can extrapolate, let's say, the fact that he is all powerful and that he is all good, that those things are clearly seen or katharatai by everybody all the time. That's the assumption of the advocate of the rebellion thesis. What that however, what that entails and what advocates of the rebellion thesis constantly miss is that that verse interpretation doesn't simply condemn atheists. It condemns every Christian who has ever had any doubt about God's existence and or God's fundamental nature. So, for example, Mother Teresa, we can often give Mother Teresa as an example. In her diary that was published after her death, there are many points at which she struggles with belief in the existence of God. She says, if there is a God, please forgive me, for example. She's wrestling with whether God is even there. And there are millions of Christians who can resonate with this struggle of faith. Now, for some, it is just part of the way they process belief. There are some people, for example, on a spectrum of autism who have a very difficult time thinking about or relating to the concept of God as an abstract, non-physical agent, for example. It would be pretty extraordinary to say all those people are in sinful rebellion against God simply in virtue of having autism and struggling with belief in God as defined in theology. It would be I think, pretty problematic to see somebody like Mother Teresa is necessarily in rebellion, suppressing the overwhelming evidence of God's existence and nature. But let me give you one more example. So this was just a heartbreaking story some years ago of a father who wrote just after his like 4-year-old child, she had died after a long struggle with cancer. Um, I shall give you two examples. So in that one, and he had taken a picture of her during one of her treatments, I think a chemo treatment, where she was in agony. And that photo, which she had posted on Facebook, just gave the briefest glimpse of the agony both that she had endured as a child with childhood cancer and which her family had endured alongside her. Imagine a father like that, if they are a Christian or a theist, how they process the existence and nature of God in the light of watching their child waste away. Second example, related, you could say, to that, but in a somewhat different way. I was haunted years ago when I saw the 2006 documentary Deliver Us from Evil, which tells the story of how a pedophile rapist priest named Father Oliver O'Grady was moved around from parish to parish in California in the 1970s and 1980s and repeatedly raped the children to which he was given access. And who parents are interviewed, well, different parents are interviewed in the documentary, and one of them was Bob Giono. Bob Giono and his wife discovered they'd always been a faithful supporter of the priest, and they discovered in the mid 1990s that this priest had in fact raped their own daughter repeatedly in their own house. After that, Bob Giono, who had been a faithful Catholic all his life, lost his Christian faith. His wife still was a Christian, but he was not. This rebellion thesis interpretation of Romans 1:20 requires you to say that Bob Giono is an active rebellion against God because God's existence and nature, God's goodness and omnipotent power are katharatai to him all the time. That God has always been clearly present to Bob Giono, but Bob Giono sinfully refuses to acknowledge that. Or this father who is grieving the loss of his child to cancer may be sinfully suppressing the fact that God is katharatai to him. I find those kinds of claims extraordinary, offensive, harmful, evil. They are a manifestation of the worst kind of word of faith theology, which blames people who suffer for their own suffering. They are entailments of the rebellion thesis interpretation of Romans 1:20. If you have adequate grounds to rethink your interpretation of Proverbs 23 based upon the overwhelming evidence that it is harmful to beat your children, if you have overwhelming evidence to rethink your interpretation of Joshua 10 based on the overwhelming evidence that the sun does not move across the sky, you certainly have overwhelming evidence to reject the claim that God is literally atheratai to all people all the time in God's existence and nature that undergirds this rebellion thesis interpretation of Romans 1:20. So to conclude, I talk about these issues at much greater length in my 2015 book, Is the Atheist My Neighbor? Rethinking Christian Attitudes Toward Atheism. In that book, I also look at a history of Christian prejudice and discrimination against atheists, and I look at other biblical, theological, and pastoral dimensions of the relationship and conversation between Christians and atheists. One of the people who has enjoyed the book, is Richard Dawkins. There you see him reading it. I posted that image years ago when I was doing fun promotion for the book, and one or two people were like, that image has been photoshopped. Well, yeah, it's a joke. Okay, Richard Dawkins hasn't actually read my book, but I do think he would do well to read Is the Atheist My Neighbor? And I think if you're interested in these topics, that you would as well.